The year was 1698. A cold Atlantic wind swept across the docks of Boston as another merchant ship slowly entered the harbor. Sailors shouted from the rigging while dock workers hurried to unload barrels of flour, timber, iron tools, and cloth. Families waited anxiously on the shoreline, hoping to recognize familiar faces among the passengers. For many of the newcomers, America was not yet a nation. It was a collection of scattered English colonies, separated by thick forests, dangerous rivers, and thousands of miles of untamed wilderness. Life here offered opportunity, but it also demanded sacrifice. Every family carried a name, and every name carried a story. Some of those stories began in tiny villages across England. Others started in Scotland, Ireland, Wales, or the Netherlands. These names crossed the Atlantic long before the United States declared independence, surviving wars, disease, famine, and generations of change. Today, millions of Americans still carry many of those same surnames. But how many people know when those names first appeared in America? How many realize that their family name may have been recorded in colonial tax books, church registers, or land grants more than 300 years ago? This is the story of 10 American last names that were already documented in the colonies before the year 1700. These surnames do not prove ancestry by themselves. Many unrelated families can share the same last name. Instead, they represent names that appear in historical records from colonial America and remain common across the United States today. Our journey begins in England during the early 17th century. Political uncertainty, religious conflict, economic hardship, and the promise of new opportunities encouraged thousands of people to leave Europe. The Atlantic crossing was long and dangerous. A voyage could last 2 months or more. Storms, disease, and food shortages were common. Yet every year, more ships sailed west. Among the passengers were farmers, blacksmiths, carpenters, merchants, ministers, and entire families willing to risk everything for a new beginning. One of the earliest and most recognizable surnames to appear in colonial records was Adams. The Adams surname originated in medieval England and literally means son of Adam. It had already existed for centuries before the first English colonies were established in North America. By the late 1630s, members of the Adams family had settled in Massachusetts Bay Colony. Colonial records mention Henry Adams, whose descendants would eventually include 2 future American presidents, John Adams and John Quincy Adams. But long before those famous names entered history books, the Adams family lived ordinary colonial lives. They cleared forests by hand. They built wooden homes using local timber. They planted crops in rocky New England soil. Every winter tested their survival. Every harvest determined whether the family would have enough food to last another year. Church records, land deeds, and probate documents show that the Adams surname gradually spread throughout Massachusetts as new generations established farms and businesses. Their story reflects the experience of countless colonial families. Not wealthy nobles, not kings, simply ordinary people, building communities that would one day become part of a new nation. The second surname on our list is Baker. Unlike Adams, Baker began as an occupational surname. In medieval England, a village baker was one of its most important residents. Bread formed the foundation of daily life, and skilled bakers supplied entire communities. Over time, the occupation became a hereditary family name. When English settlers crossed the Atlantic, they brought that name with them. By the middle of the 17th century, Baker families appeared in both Virginia and Massachusetts. Some owned farmland, others became craftsmen. Several colonial records mention bakers purchasing land, witnessing legal documents, and participating in local government. These were not famous individuals whose portraits hung in museums. Yet without families like theirs, colonial settlements could never have expanded. Every growing town needed food production, construction, transportation, and trade. The bakers helped provide that stability. As the colonies became more established, Another surname quietly appeared in official records. It would eventually become one of the most common names in America: Brown. At first glance, Brown seems almost too ordinary to attract attention. But historians see something different. The surname likely originated as a description of physical appearance: someone with brown hair, dark eyes, or darker clothing. Its simplicity made it extremely common throughout England and Scotland. When migration to North America accelerated during the 17th century, Brown families settled across several colonies, including Virginia, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Maryland. Colonial court records reveal Browns serving on juries, buying property, paying taxes, and participating in local government. Their lives were rarely easy. A single crop failure could leave an entire household struggling. Harsh winters often destroyed stored food supplies. Medical care barely existed. Children faced diseases that modern medicine can now prevent. Yet generation after generation, these families endured. By the end of the 17th century, the Brown surname had spread throughout the English colonies. Centuries later, it remains one of the most common surnames in the United States. Its survival tells a remarkable story, not of kings or generals, but of perseverance, of families whose greatest achievement was simply refusing to give up. As more immigrants continued arriving from Europe, America's population slowly increased. New settlements appeared farther inland, roads connected isolated communities, trade expanded between colonies. Every arriving ship added another chapter to the growing story of colonial America. And with every new arrival came another family name that would eventually become part of American history. One of those names belonged to skilled craftsmen whose work shaped nearly every building in the colonies. Their surname was Carpenter. The Carpenter surname first appeared in medieval England as an occupational name for skilled woodworkers. In the 17th century, no colonial town could survive without them. They built homes that protected families from harsh winters. They raised churches where communities gathered every Sunday. They constructed warehouses along busy ports and repaired the wooden ships that carried supplies across the Atlantic. Colonial records from Massachusetts and Virginia show carpenter families purchasing land as early as the 1630s and 1640s. Some became respected craftsmen. Others expanded into farming and local trade. Their work shaped nearly every colonial settlement. Without skilled carpenters, America could not have grown. Imagine walking through Boston in 1685. The streets are narrow. The smell of freshly cut pine fills the air. Hammers echo through the town as new homes rise one beam at a time. Every structure represents countless hours of careful craftsmanship. Some of those buildings were created by men whose surnames simply described what they did every day. Their family names survived long after later generations entered different professions. That pattern appears repeatedly throughout American history. Occupations disappeared, the surnames remained. Another occupation produced one of colonial America's most valuable family names, Cooper. Today, most people rarely think about wooden barrels. 400 years ago, barrels were essential to everyday life. Food traveled inside them. Water was stored inside them. Flour, tobacco, salted meat, fish, gunpowder, rum, and even nails depended on strong wooden barrels for transport and storage. The craftsmen who built those barrels were called coopers. Historical records from the 17th century mention Cooper families living in Massachusetts, Virginia, and Pennsylvania before 1700. Some continued making barrels for decades. Others became merchants, farmers, or ship owners. But their surname remained a reminder of an occupation that once powered the colonial economy. Every merchant ship leaving an American harbor carried hundreds of barrels. Without skilled coopers, long-distance trade would have been nearly impossible. Their contribution often goes unnoticed today, yet their work supported nearly every industry in colonial America. As settlements became stronger, Another surname quietly spread throughout the colonies. Davis, the Davis surname, comes from the given name David, meaning beloved. Originally common in Wales and England, it crossed the Atlantic during the early waves of English migration. By the middle of the 17th century, Davis families appeared in Virginia, Maryland, and New England. Colonial documents show them farming fertile land, serving in local militias, operating small businesses, and participating in town government. Unlike famous political leaders, these families rarely appeared in history books, but together they formed the backbone of colonial society. Each harvest strengthened local communities. Each successful farm helped feed growing settlements. Each generation expanded farther into the American frontier. Their story represents thousands of ordinary families whose quiet determination shaped the future of the colonies. As the population continued growing, immigration brought even more surnames to North America. Some disappeared after only a generation. Others spread rapidly across multiple colonies. One of those names carried a long English history: Johnson. Derived from the phrase, son of John, Johnson became one of the most widespread surnames in Britain long before colonization. When settlers arrived in America, they carried that name with them. By the late 1600s, Johnson families were documented throughout Virginia, New York, Massachusetts, and the Carolinas. Some worked as blacksmiths, others became merchants, several owned farmland near expanding colonial towns. Their experiences reflected the changing nature of colonial America. The earliest settlements had focused simply on survival. Now communities were beginning to prosper. Roads connected towns. Trade increased. Schools appeared. Local governments became more organized. Families bearing surnames like Johnson participated in nearly every aspect of that transformation. They helped turn scattered settlements into permanent communities. By the dawn of the 18th century, these names had become deeply rooted in colonial society, yet our list is far from complete. Several additional surnames had already established remarkable histories before the year 1700. Some would later become associated with Revolutionary War heroes. Others would spread across every corner of the growing United States. Their stories reveal how ordinary families helped build a nation long before it officially existed. By the beginning of the 18th century, the English colonies were changing faster than anyone could have imagined. What had once been a chain of fragile coastal settlements was becoming a network of growing towns connected by trade, rivers, and newly built roads. Families who had arrived decades earlier were no longer simply trying to survive. Their children had become landowners, merchants, craftsmen, soldiers, and community leaders. Their surnames were becoming part of America's story. One of those names was Miller. Originally, the surname described someone who operated a grain mill. In colonial America, mills were among the most valuable buildings in any settlement. Farmers depended on them to grind wheat and corn into flour, making them essential for everyday life. Historical records from Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Maryland show Miller families living in the colonies before 1700. Some owned mills, while others became farmers and traders. Every harvest season, long lines of wagons waited outside local mills. Families traveled for miles, carrying sacks of grain. The mill transformed their crops into flour that could feed entire communities through the winter. Without millers, colonial settlements could not grow. Another surname with deep colonial roots was Taylor. Like Baker and Carpenter, Taylor began as an occupational name. It referred to someone who made or repaired clothing. In the 17th century, clothing was expensive. Every coat, shirt, dress, and blanket was made by hand. Skilled tailors played an important role in every growing town. Colonial records mention tailor families in Virginia, Massachusetts, and New York before the end of the 17th century. Some eventually became merchants. Others entered politics or local government. But the surname survived long after later generations left the tailoring trade behind. One final surname appears repeatedly throughout early American records: Clark. Derived from the medieval word for a clerk or educated record keeper, the Clark surname spread rapidly throughout the English colonies. Clerks recorded births, marriages, land sales, wills, taxes, and court decisions because literacy was uncommon during the 17th century. Educated clerks held important positions within colonial governments. Historical documents from Massachusetts, Virginia, and Connecticut include numerous Clark families before 1700. Some served churches, others worked directly with colonial officials. Their careful records now provide historians with priceless evidence about early American life. Ironically, without people named Clark, much of colonial history might have been lost forever. By the year 1700, thousands of European settlers had established permanent communities across North America. Their surnames reflected many different origins. Some described occupations, some identified fathers. Others referred to physical appearance or places of origin. Together, they became part of America's cultural foundation, yet an important question remains. Does sharing one of these surnames mean someone is directly descended from those early colonial families? The answer is not necessarily. Genealogists emphasize that a surname alone cannot prove ancestry. Many unrelated families share identical last names. Immigration continued for centuries after 1700, bringing entirely new families carrying the same surnames. The only reliable way to confirm family history is through historical records, documented family trees, and, when appropriate, genetic genealogy. Even so, these surnames remain fascinating because they connect us to the earliest chapters of American history. Every colonial document tells a story. A land deed reveals where a family settled. A church register records a child's baptism. A marriage license marks the beginning of a new generation. A handwritten will shows what parents hope to leave behind. Together, these fragile records allow historians to reconstruct lives that might otherwise have disappeared forever. The people behind these names were rarely famous. Most never expected future generations to remember them. They simply wanted a safe place to raise their children. They cleared forests with hand tools, built homes from rough timber, survived freezing winters, endured disease outbreaks, worked fields from sunrise until sunset, and despite enormous hardships, they created communities that continued growing long after they were gone. Their greatest legacy was not wealth, it was continuity. Generation after generation, their surnames remained. Today, millions of Americans unknowingly carry names that appeared in colonial records more than 3 centuries ago. Whether your surname is Adams, Baker, Brown, Carpenter, Cooper, Davis, Johnson, Miller, Taylor, Clark, or something entirely different, every family has a story waiting to be discovered. The journey into the past often begins with a single name. And sometimes, that single name opens the door to centuries of forgotten history. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to explore more forgotten American history, early colonial families, and the true origins of famous surnames, don't forget to subscribe and join us for the next investigation, because history isn't just found in museums. Sometimes, it's already written in your name. End of script.